And the floor is yours, Karin. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ira. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you. I have, I guess, had the fortune of been doing sustainability work for long enough to have started before there was any education in sustainability. And when we first started getting letters at Rainforest Alliance from students, often at that time, elementary school students, and then getting older, saying that they had learned about rainforests or sustainability in school, it really made me realize just how important that was. And I now have a teenager who has the good fortune here in the UK of having a tremendous amount of sustainability education in secondary school. So I'm pleased to be with all of you here today. Just a real briefly on ISEAL, and then I'm going to come back to us at the end. We are a membership association for sustainability standards, and our mission is to strengthen sustainability standard systems for the benefit of people and the environment. So today, just a little overview of my presentation. I'm going to focus on what are sustainability standards, by our definition, at least. How they're being used by governments and businesses, with some trends there in how they're being used. And then a bit of a focus on the impacts of sustainability standards. This is a big area of our work. And then an overview of who is ISEAL Alliance and what is it that we do? What is our role in this community? So as an introduction to sustainability standard systems, and I'll come back to what that means to us. We see sustainability standards as market-based tools to drive sustainable production and consumption. And standards really are a vehicle for defining good practice for social, environmental, and economic performance, either in a product or a sector or a process. There's lots of different types of standards, and we sometimes find these conversations confusing when we're talking to a broad audience because everyone comes with a different assumption of what we're talking about when we're talking about standards. So for today's presentation, I'm really going to be focusing primarily on what we call process or production standards. So a process being something like organic production is a process, or primary production on a farm or a forest or a factory being a single phase of production. There are many different other types of standards. Some of them we can see here: management systems, a life cycle approach, or single attribute, which might just be about pesticide content. Well, that could be a product or a single attribute, actually. So just to be clear, we're focusing primarily on process and production, and hopefully that'll become clearer as we move forward. The other thing to note is when we talk about standards, we actually talk about standard systems, because the standard itself, the definition of good practice, is really only one way of driving change. So the standard is an important part of driving change, but we look at all the activities that bring about those practices. So the standard setting being a real critical central element of it, but also looking at capacity building, the assurance process, that's often called certification, but sometimes it's something like a verification or another checking mechanism. It could include claims and labeling. So how do you communicate the change that's been made? Marketing and measuring impacts, which we think is also a critical part of that system. And so we say, sometimes we find that's all given shorthand of certification or standards. But we see that that's really a holistic system that drives change. And here we've tried to give a bit of a picture as to what that system looks like. So the standard in our definition, being a multi-stakeholder based standard, where you have input from a range of affected actors who work together to define the criteria for that standard. There are other approaches where you might take a pure scientific calculation approach, and that might be the right approach for certain types of standards. In other cases where you have quite a difference of opinion perhaps, or where there is even opening for opinion, social issues or some issues around biodiversity, where you really need stakeholder input to define the best approach. That's where we're looking at multi-stakeholder engagement in the standard setting. And then here you see, moving on to the actual implementation on a farm or forest or fishery operation, maybe in a manufacturing environment. You might have capacity building organizations that provide support to those entities to make the changes they need. You'll have your audit or verification process, perhaps overseen by an accreditation body of some sort, not always. And then you might have a chain of custody or traceability system that actually follows that certified product all the way to the consumer, where you may or may not have a label. Not all certified products end up in a directly labeled manner, but many of them do as well. And so we look at all of that and we say, this is a system, this is a standard system, and much of our work is focused on how do you ensure credibility and effectiveness so that you have the greatest impact possible in that system. So why did sustainability standards emerge? Why do they exist? You know, why don't we just have legislation or laws that govern these practices? You know, over the past 20 and I would say even 30 or more years, we're seeing trends around globalization. So deregulation combined with privatization of responsibility on social and environmental issues, and at the same time recognition of the global nature of many of those issues, indicated a need to find some different form of governance of good practice for businesses. In some cases, the failure of governments. So in some cases, the failure to actually provide oversight of laws even that exist in some regions of the world, or to create laws to adequately govern certain issues, or an inability to reach international agreement. And in fact, I think this slide was written before some of the current international agreements were developed. But the initial question about the extent to which governments were providing the needed oversight. And then as we were seeing increased consumption, the backlash and recognition that there was need to have some responsibility in terms of both production and consumption. So that emergence of the concept of corporate social responsibility, and that businesses do have a role, and the movement in that sort of 30-year period away from a boycott approach to a partnership approach with NGOs and nonprofits, really looking to work with businesses to help identify and implement more responsible practices. And a little history here, you know, the organic movement really going all the way back to the 1940s sort of started a bit this idea of responsible production. IFOAM, the International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movement, started in the 1970s. And then starting with some of the first eco-labels, so the Blue Angel in Germany as one of the first eco-labels. Moving into the Fairtrade movement in the late 80s, Rainforest Alliance and the Sustainable Agriculture Network launching their work in the early 90s. Forest Stewardship Council coming along then. So really starting then to move into this idea of multi-stakeholder engagement in defining good practices. And while they weren't called sustainability standards then, really the first movement into sustainability standards. Interestingly, I'm often asked, well, why isn't ISO just doing this? Why do we need this other approach? ISO's first environmental management system standard, ISO 14001 didn't start until the late 90s. So there was a period where these different approaches were emerging. And while ISO was very focused on more technical standards. In the late 90s, we also then started to see alternatives to Forest Stewardship Council. So in the US, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative is part of the, I'm going to have trouble, PEFC, I'm going to have trouble with their acronym. And we started seeing at that same time some real major buyer commitments to sustainable forestry. So Home Depot in the US and IKEA globally, both taking a big role in driving demand for sustainable forest management. And then it continued to grow from there with companies like Unilever being one of the big drivers behind the launch of the Marine Stewardship Council, labor standards based on the ILO in Social Accountability International. ISEAL was founded in 2002, so the first idea of these standards need to collaborate and work together. And then towards the 2007, 2008, and to today, we have this large box of we're just seeing an explosion of interest in new sectors, new standards, new approaches to using the tool of multi-stakeholder-based sustainability standards. And I can talk about that a little more when I come to ISEAL. So I'll just give a couple of concrete examples. Sometimes the abstract gets a little challenging. One case study would be Fairtrade International, which many of you would have probably heard of. Fairtrade focuses on social development built into organizational structure. So the idea of small producers, smallholder farmers, in most cases, having a organizing structure, whether it be a community-based operation, a cooperative, or some other grouping that enables them to drive some of the changes in social development within their community. Economic development through a minimum price or a price premium. And then agricultural practices that ensure environmental safeguards and development, and the prohibition of forced and child labor. So those are the key issues that are in their standard. And they work in 139 countries, primarily Africa, Asia, Middle East, Latin America, the Caribbean and Pacific Islands. They don't currently have certification available in the EU or G7 countries. So they very much came out of a poverty alleviation sort of north-south trade approach that's interestingly evolving now into a south-south trade approach as well, with quite a bit of development on emerging economy markets and not just seeing it as a north-south approach. Another case study here would be the Forest Stewardship Council. Their key issues in their standard would include protection of ecosystems through responsible forest management. They're very careful not to say sustainable forest management because they recognize that sustainability is a journey, and they don't feel that you're guaranteed full sustainability by implementing their standards. So they do call it responsible forest management. And they include empowerment of people who live and work in the forest. So looking at indigenous people's rights, community rights, forest worker safety. And Forest Stewardship Council, I hope you can read some of the information here. This is just a forest area certified forest area visualization. They're present in 83 countries with about 1,500 forest management certificates. And they have a similar, even more extensive graphic of their chain of custody coverage. So I think they work in 160 countries where they have operations along the supply chain that have been certified as chain of custody operations. So from the 83 where they have managed forests, it extends around the world in terms of where products are traded and sold, processed, traded and sold. And you'll see here that you see quite extensive coverage in, well, really in the northern biomes. So North America, Canada, and Russia are sort of three of the most extensive certified areas. When we look at the sustainability issues that multi-stakeholder standards that we work with are contributing to, we look at economic, social, and environmental impact areas, and we see quite a range. I'm not going to read these all out here for you, but things from higher yields and productivity or income stability on the economic side to human and labor rights, improved working conditions, reduce discrimination on the social side, and then quite a range of things on the environmental side, including forest and biodiversity conservation, water and air conservation protection, ecosystem resiliency. So a range of topics that not every standard will try to cover all of these topics. So you find in different sectors, different focus based on the critical issues that they have the ability to positively or negatively impact. But these are a range of the things that are covered across standards. So moving on to the questions around the use of standards in the public and private sectors. See if I can move this out of the way. There we go. I want to talk just a little bit about, first about how standards are growing. It's interesting to see, when even 5 or 7 years ago, there was quite a lot of talk of standards being niche production, and that this was quite a sort of luxury concept. Well, we're now really seeing pretty mainstream market penetration in some sectors. So in coffee, 38% certified, forestry, 30% certified, palm oil, 17%, and so on. And we're seeing rapid growth rates. So this is somewhat dated now, but I would actually venture to say that the curve would be even steeper. So this chart here is 2008 to 2012, showing rapid growth across a range of sectors from a report that you can find online called the State of Sustainability Initiatives. This is somewhat dated here, but they do have a report from, I want to say 2016, that includes quite a lot of market data. And it would show an even more rapid growth in the years since 2012. And any of you who are really interested in diving into some of that data, I recommend their report. It's got a lot of information packed in it and it's quite interesting. So we also see standards, this concept of multi-stakeholder sustainability standards with the system around it being applied in a really wide range of sectors. So our members alone cover almost all of these sectors, from sort of primary production of natural resource-based sectors to moving into things like oil and gas or sustainable tourism, green building in the US, the LEED standard and LEED certification is quite popular, and as well in many universities with new building. And we're also seeing growth in new sectors. So right now we're seeing quite a, well, I want to say explosion, a range of standards being developed in mining sectors. So it might be a narrow focus like artisanal gold miners, or it could be a broad focus along, you know, elements of the supply chain. There's standards coming out for aluminum, for steel, for gold. There's sort of several that are being developed around mining. You see infrastructure right now is another area where standards are being developed, climate and carbon issues. So quite a range of different types of standards that are really sectors that might be newer to the idea of sustainability and are seeing the platform that a multi-stakeholder engagement and dialogue brings to provide an opportunity for them to understand the issues and possibilities for transforming their sector in terms of sustainable practices. So looking at how governments use standards, this is quite an interesting area where, you know, in that earlier slide, I said that one of the reasons that some of these earlier standards started was a failure on the part of governments to play certain roles, perhaps. And now we're seeing that governments are using standards in a pretty wide range of ways. Either certification of public bodies, so it could be forestry operations or fisheries where you have a heavy management land ownership from the government. It might be incentives to encourage industry uptake, referencing standards in legislation, recognizing certification as one mechanism for complying with a legislation, public procurement, or perhaps step approaches between a government sort of baseline and an international higher bar sustainability standard. And I have some examples. On the competitiveness side, and this could also be seen as one of these sort of baseline and international, sort of local international interfaces. There's a standard in Brazil called Certifica Minas. It's in the state of Minas Gerais, which is the largest coffee growing state in Brazil. And they've developed a state-driven, so the state government has developed this standard. They've developed partnerships with some of the international coffee standards, and they use their standard primarily for capacity building. So the extension officers, the trainers do extensive training of coffee producers in this standard. It's used some for the domestic market, and it's used to benchmark against international standards. And they see that as an opportunity to increase the competitiveness of the local producers. In Mozambique, the government has, over quite a period of time of relationship building and trust building, developed a relationship with the Better Cotton Initiative, where they've now decided to get 100% of the cotton producers in the country certified to the Better Cotton Initiative. Better Cotton is a very capacity development approach. So their standard is very much about capacity building. And this is the government's way of saying this is going to really up the recognition in the international market, access to buyers and market, and provide some capacity building, other resources to producers. This idea of jurisdictional approaches is very interesting. It's a very new approach. It's still very unproven, but currently being tested, where a particular jurisdiction, so it could be a regional government, is looking at how they could use a standard. In this case, there are some pilots that are happening with the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil in Indonesia, where regional governments are looking at using the standard as a approach to production similar to the Mozambique example, but not at a whole country level, more at a regional level, and where the government is very heavily involved in supporting the training and capacity building and whatever other resources are needed to implement those changing practices. And then public procurement in the UK, there's a forestry legislation that requires a certain level of sustainability for the forest products that are imported into the country. FSC is seen as meeting those requirements, also PEFC, which I mentioned earlier. They have the concept of or equivalent, so it is an option for a forestry importer or operator to demonstrate in some other way that they comply with the forestry legislation, but it's certainly easier for them to sort of plug and play, work with an existing certification program. And there, interestingly, the UK government set up an entire resource service for government procurement buyers, but then also for the broader market in the UK to identify where they could get products from, and to help smooth the supply chains a little bit, so that the legislation didn't become a barrier in the market. A few things on how businesses are using standards. I think this is really, well, like governments, not that the government element isn't interesting because it's fascinating. It's really evolving rapidly as well. The way businesses are using standards is also really evolving. 15 or 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, often businesses were starting to work with standards from a real marketing approach. It was the marketing teams that were deciding they wanted to have a label on their product. And it was less about what's our corporate sustainability strategy and more about what's our positioning and how can we use this label to change our positioning. Now businesses are seeing standards in quite a range of different ways. So much more of a following their corporate sustainability goals and then saying what standards do we need to achieve our sustainability goals. Still looking at the brand, but it's much more of a big picture risk mitigation, brand enhancement, rather than being about labels sell more product. So, to what extent does a company position itself as being a leader in sustainability, or a company that cares at least about sustainability? And that's quite a different calculation we're seeing in corporate decision making than I just want a label on this product. We hear in other parts of the world where perhaps they're not yet leaders, they're just getting started on sustainability, that there's a real need to understand how to, you say, okay, sustainability as a company, you might set some big picture goals, but then how do you actually do that on the ground? How do you operationalize that? And so standards really being used as a real roadmap to how to do it through supply chains. The risk mitigation element still really important, especially in sectors where you have real concern about deforestation or child labor or some of the high profile risk areas that the ability to engage intensely in the supply chain is something that standards give them. And then access to new markets, especially from the producers that are implementing these practices and are looking to open up markets. So we've also done quite a lot of work to understand what benefits businesses say they are realizing as a result of working with standards. I'll talk more about sustainability impacts, and you could argue that the business impacts is one more piece of that, but I've chosen to stick it in here, how businesses are using standards. So we have a very new study that was published just this year on the business benefits of using sustainability standards. It was commissioned by ISEAL and conducted by a consultancy called Aid Environment that's based in the Netherlands. And they did a meta review of research evidence on business benefits. So they identified 140 studies. They chose 40 that they felt were robust to work from. And they looked at a range of different types of studies and then validated their findings by sort of triangulating that a little bit. And in their studies, they looked both at upstream and downstream businesses in agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and mining. So they really looked from the producer organizations all the way through importers, processors, and to brand and retail. And they have a pretty even number of studies that touch those different sort of upstream and downstream businesses. And they have a number of findings. So two of the early benefits that accrued to both upstream and downstream businesses were improved market access and improved business operations. So 85% of businesses reporting improved market access and 78% of them reporting improved business operations. And we found that there's both early benefits and later benefits as a result of using standards. So the early benefits are more easily directly attributable to the use of standards. As you get farther out in time, it becomes a little harder. But these here are early benefits. I hope that you can read this. Some of this is small, but we see things like the statistics we just gave on 78% of them showing increased operational benefits, and some of that coming around operational efficiency and risk management on the upstream business and sustainability strategy on the downstream businesses. I'm just going to skip around a little bit here. 98% of them reporting improved sales and marketing related benefits. So market access being substantial, both for upstream and downstream businesses. A little less in terms of impacts, but still positive on stakeholder engagement. Interestingly, access to finance is a growing area where we are seeing the finance sector increasingly paying attention to sustainable practices and to the potential for sustainable businesses because of their increased operational efficiency and risk management, and some of the other elements of the business benefits, that the finance sector is becoming more interested. So I would imagine that actually number to improve over time as the finance sector becomes more and more interested. And then we have some final benefits, and I don't know how final was defined in these studies, but one of the real high performers here is around reputation or license to operate. So upstream businesses really seeing that, again, that point I was making about brand reputation, it's not all about consumer demand. It's really more about this broader reputational change. Interesting profitability changes on both upstream and downstream, and also sustainability impacts. We've also done a number of business case studies that are not so heavy academic research based, but that are more interviews with the companies themselves, where they tell us what benefits they or what value they see from working with standards. And I've just pulled one out here for you. We have a whole bunch of them that are on our website that we can pull up later. We can show you later where to find them. But IKEA is one we pulled out because what's interesting about IKEA is that we think of IKEA as a place to go buy furniture and maybe meatballs, and yet they are heavily involved with a whole range of standards. And these sectors you see across the bottom: coffee, cocoa, cotton, tea, seafood, wood, and other crops. I mean, they've been heavily involved with some of the newly emerging leather standards, for example. You know, all of the areas in which they work, heavily focused on sourcing from sustainable sources, and certification being seen as a key part of their strategy in doing that. And they see that standards give them, you know, they can't handle taking their own custom approach to sustainability in every sector, so that they see by partnering with certification programs that they can develop the trust in what their suppliers are doing and focus their their efforts then on either sustainability in sectors where it's just emerging. So they've been behind some of the beef sustainability work as well. So that eventually we can buy maybe sustainable meatballs. And they really see standards and certification as a key long-term benefit for them. I want to make sure we mention emerging economies as well in terms of the way standards are used, because obviously going forward, the emerging economies are quite critical to the question of the global economy and global trade. And we are seeing emerging economies now as both sort of recipients or takers of standards, but also makers of standards, with more and more interest from emerging economies in having sort of local ownership and engagement in developing definitions of good practice. As we've seen both increasing political and strategic influence from emerging economies in the WTO, at the World Bank, in the finance sector. Some of the international buyers like IKEA and others that are making global commitments to sustainability are bringing those commitments to all of the regions of the world in which they work. Quite interesting discussions we're having right now in China in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. What is the role of China going abroad, and what kinds of practices is it going to bring in doing that? And to what extent are sustainability standards important elements of their increased economic presence, you know, as they go forward? So quite a strong interest from emerging markets. We have been doing work in Brazil, India, and China for the last 6 years. And I would say that 5 years ago, we would often have to talk about what is sustainability and why is that important. 2 weeks ago, I was in Indonesia and we had a symposium in Jakarta where it was primarily businesses there, Indonesian businesses, and they all are focusing on sustainability. And so they were coming at our discussion at a whole different level now, 5 years later. So quite a lot of engagement from really globally. And so you see uptake of international standards, you see development of local standards. There's quite a movement around association sustainability standards in China, so sector associations. And you see this coordination between local and international standards. I mentioned this Certifica Minas program earlier. So I want to move on to impacts. What do we know? What do we know about the social and environmental impacts of standards? This is an area we've been working on very intensely for the last several years to build capacity in sustainability standards, ability to monitor and report on and learn from their impacts, and coordinating with the research community on what questions are important to the broader standards community, so that as research is being done on the impacts of standards, that it's research that's actually able to be used and brought back to the community, with a real focus on increasing impacts and improving systems. I'm not going to talk, I realize this is going to be too long if I talk too much about all of these, but we've done a set of a meta-analysis ourselves of research studies that are looking at the contribution of sustainability standards to the SDGs. So we say here research shows. We actually have a whole list of research studies that we've pulled from here. And if anyone wants to see those, we can provide those later. So here we've done an analysis of contribution to sustainable agriculture, sustainable agriculture standards contributions to SDG 2, so ending hunger. And we've looked at what are the ways they contribute to this SDG. So whether it be through access to training and knowledge to boost farm productivity through better practices, or higher income from the sale of certified crops, or reducing ecological footprint. And a whole bunch of data that we've pulled from these research studies around increasing yields, increasing sort of yield across sectors, so cocoa, palm oil, cotton, and looking at farmer incomes and profitability. So this is showing income for farmers certified versus non-certified in coffee farmers in Nicaragua, banana farmers in Colombia, and across different standard systems as well. Likewise on SDG 8, the decent work and economic growth, looking at how standards can promote inclusive economic growth, and trying to understand what is it about the way the system works, the standard system, that drives those impacts or those changes. So access to training, again, being critical, implementing the ILO core conventions, keeping up with, really providing an extra check on compliance with legislation, which doesn't happen in all of the world, and criteria on child labor and community awareness around that issue. I think I'm going to skip over this one just because it's a little too much, and in the interest of making sure we have time for questions. Similar approach to economic productivity and entrepreneurship in sectors as broad as the rug weaving industry in Nepal, to fisheries in South Africa, and Forest Stewardship Council in the Congo Basin. So really looking at workers' economic productivity and entrepreneurship, and then worker safety, rights, and well-being. Quite a bit of interesting data there. I'm going to skip over this one to give a call out for a website that we launched really just some months ago at the beginning of this year, called standardsimpacts.org. So all of that information that I just presented can be found on this website. Sorry, and the slide that I just skipped over with a number of other reports, they're all there. You can sort by region, by sector, and it's quite a useful and growing resource of information on impacts. So to have a little bit of time about ISEAL, I mentioned that we are an association of sustainability standards. We're a membership organization. We were founded in 2002, we're not-for-profit and based in London. And our goals are to deliver credibility expertise, to measure and share impacts, to catalyze improvements and scalable solutions, and to build support for credible standards. And we do this, I'm going to focus on just a couple of these right now that I think are particularly relevant. These are our current members. We are quite proactive in reaching out and bringing our definition and of good practices to the broader world of standards. These are the standard systems that are currently full members. We have about another 75 standard systems that are engaged with ISEAL through our community. Some of them are not members yet because they're just getting started in developing a standard. And currently they have to be fully functional to be able to become a member. So we engage with them through the community as they're just getting started on their developing their standard. In other cases, they're not quite the model that currently is eligible for membership, but we try to be quite broad in our engagement with all sorts of mature and emerging standards. So one of the critical things that we do, one of the sort of, I guess, foundational things that we do is define credible practices. And we have a set of credibility principles that were developed in a multi-stakeholder consultation approach. These credibility principles were developed through a global consultation. So we did, in addition to sort of online consultation, in-country workshops in the US, UK, Europe, Brazil, India, and China to get input on what does it mean to, what are the core principles of credibility. And each of these principles has quite a lengthy, several paragraphs that explain what we mean when we say accessibility. We talk about things like all producers, small and large, that have access to using the standard. That the standard isn't written in a way that really excludes key elements of the production or supply chain. That it's transparent. So all of the information about how a standard is developed, how the system works, is available on their website, that you can easily go and have access to the standard itself, to any information about how the system works, to how the standard is set. Things like engagement. So we would look at how are stakeholders engaged to participate in the standard setting? Are they only doing an online consultation, which means that maybe, and only in one language, which may mean that many people aren't able to find the information? Or have they actually really sufficiently identified who their stakeholders are and how they need to go out there and reach them to get input into the standard? So these principles are we see as the overarching umbrella then for the standard system. That was that sort of oval that I showed earlier, and also for our codes of good practice. So we take these then into a deeper level of detail. And we have 3 codes of good practice: a code for standard setting, a code for impact monitoring, and a code for assurance or certification. And each of these codes sits underneath these credibility principles and is also developed in this multi-stakeholder consultation process. And these codes are what our members are required to comply with in order to become members. But they're also tools that we have out there in the world that we want to have very proactively used by as wide a range of actors as possible. So we see interesting things where perhaps a company is developing its own code. They may call it a standard or not, but they may use elements of our standard setting code to think about what is important in terms of transparency, or what kind of consultation may they want to do on developing their code so that they are a bit more credible in how they do it. Or they're taking elements of the impacts code and they're actually monitoring the impacts of their own internal system. So we're very sort of actively do training in our codes, and they're freely available on our website. And while they are used for compliance for our members, they're also really out there and available to the world at large. Another tool that we have that's available for you, and I put this up just to mention it, we did a guide around claims and labeling last year, and part of that was also a campaign around what are credible sustainability claims and what do you need to look for as a user of standards to know that the standard is credible. And so we called it Challenge the Label. Behind the claim were these 5 universal truths, and it was really more of a set of, in each of the 5 areas, questions that you need to ask to understand whether or not a system is credible and whether or not it's actually truthful. And so it sort of guides you through the set of questions so that you can go and do additional probing into how a system works and what's behind the system. So that website is still up, challengethelabel.org, and I encourage you to go take a look there. Another thing we do, so defining credible practices has been, as I said, the sort of foundation of our work. Once standard systems become members of ISEAL, what we're really looking to do is to drive impacts, drive effectiveness, and we do that through collaboration and coordination. And so we see ourselves as being a convening platform. It's often driven by member interest, although we're also out talking to stakeholders and trying to really understand what those key issues are that users of standards are concerned about in terms of improvements and changes. And we really also look for the potential for harmonization or simplification across systems. So just some examples of the collaborations that we've got going on currently. We have a set of standard systems that have been working together for several years now on issue of pesticides. So they are looking at a common approach to the pesticides that might be banned through their standard. But more importantly, now they've been working on common approaches to alternatives to those banned pesticides. So rather than just saying, don't use these pesticides, they're also saying, and we're going to help you figure out what you should use instead. They are now working on a joint database that can make this information publicly available and a global resource to really help drive the reduction in some of the worst pesticides around the world. We have a collaboration on living wage, where another set of standard systems have come together to develop a shared methodology around measuring living wage. They've been working with some external experts on this topic, have agreed on an approach, and have been working on, there's almost now published about 20 benchmarks in different areas around the world on living wage, so that over time, gradually, they can help to increase wages that are paid in certified operations. Some of the topics that have been discussed sort of going forward, collaboration around gender issues, biodiversity, quite a range of different actual content topics that we work with our members to collaborate on. And we're also very focused right now on driving sort of innovations or evolution in the effectiveness of standard systems. A lot of this is responding to input from businesses and others that work with standards and have given feedback about what works and what could work better. And so we've been focused now on looking at 5 to 10 years out from now, what's the future of standards and certification or verification. Standard systems haven't always kept up as well as they could have on new technologies. So as we think about delivering greater value in the supply chain to all of the users of standards, we need to think about, how can they be better data managers, and how can that add value in the supply chain? How can they be more efficient and provide more real-time information through technology? How do they take more of a risk-based approach to both provide more confidence and reduce concerns around risk? How can they look at stepwise approaches to help the lowest performing enterprises or producers to increase their levels of sustainability and then keep growing from there? And how do they start to look at a landscape or seascape level and not just individual operational levels? So we do quite a lot of shared learning, bringing in external expertise to the standard systems to help drive some of these changes. And before we open up for questions, just some ideas on ways to get involved with ISEAL, should you be so inclined. We have a news bulletin, the ISEAL bulletin you can sign up for. That also gives access to certain information. If you become a subscriber, we have an online community. We do have various discussion groups, webinars, and events like an annual conference, training activities, and our codes of good practice. And we have a video series. If you're interested, they're all really short, and some of them probably you could watch and get much of what I said today, and maybe faster and more graphic approach. But 3 minutes, if you wanted to use any of them in your curriculum, they're absolutely there to be used. So feel free. We want them to be used as much as possible. And so thank you. And I will turn it back over to Ira to share your questions.
Thank you so much, Karin. That was a terrific presentation. And from my own 20 years plus experience in the standards realm, I can say it's no small feat to provide a balanced introduction to the concepts and principles involved with sustainability standards and provide a snapshot of the current landscape. So thank you very much for that presentation. We do have some questions and comments that have come in, and I've done my best to try to sort them for you, Karin. First, I'll say that, of course, our audience is predominantly teaching faculty at the university level. And one of the reasons why we were so interested in having you do this webinar and present ISEAL's good work is that the sense that while there may be some researchers looking closely at the impacts of sustainability standards, I'll speak for myself. My own experience is that I've rarely seen the topic of standards generally or sustainability standards specifically covered in undergraduate law or business courses, with the possible occasional exception of Forest Stewardship Council case studies or sustainable seafood case studies or the controversies over palm oil. So for anyone who was unfamiliar with sustainability standards, and I think that includes most of us on the line, this, as intended, was a real eye-opener. In particular, your discussion of the range of benefits of sustainability standards, and I think most folks were probably surprised by the penetration or mainstreaming of sustainability standards, particularly in the coffee and forestry sectors. So following up on that, there were, again, given the novice level of some of the attendees, there were requests for you to either repeat or clarify some of the more basic things that you mentioned in the course of the presentation. And I'll just give you three for you to address in any way you would like, or to pass, as the case may be. So one person wrote in saying, the phrase multi-stakeholder has been mentioned on numerous occasions. Why is that so fundamental to sustainability standards? And that may seem like a basic question, but I think one that we shouldn't skip over. Similarly, another individual asked if you could explain the difference between certification and a certificate. And finally, I think referring to one of your opening slides where you emphasize the first two types of standards, if you might be able to just run through the typology of standards, let's call it, one more time. And I'll leave you with those three for starters, Karin.
Great. So thank you for all of you for your questions. And one thing I have certainly learned over the years is it's darn hard to explain the basics, and there is no stupid question. So why do we see multi-stakeholder engagement in the standard setting as so critical for sustainability standards? And I think that there's a few reasons. One is that these are meant to really be practical, implementable approaches. And unless you have industry, so unless you have the various market players, as well as usually some academics or scientists or researchers that have some concrete sustainability information, and usually NGOs that are advocating for better production, when you bring them all together, you're more likely to end up with an agreement that will both satisfy the activists in terms of a higher level of performance, sustainability performance, but also be realistic in terms of what is practical by, let's call them business, but it could be small farmer, it could be Mr. and Mrs. Small Farmer, or it could be, a very big company like Unilever, but you need them to come together to agree what's actually realistic for industry, small and large, to implement. Because otherwise what you get is these expectations of extremely high performance, which you could have a standard that's the absolute, 5-star gold standard, but 2% of the producers are going to be able to do it. Or you could have some sort of compromise where you still make improvements, but a larger proportion of the producers or the industry, the sector, is going to be able to actually do it. And it's in that compromise, really, that you see the value then of actually getting traction on the changes that are needed. Because if they come together and agree, then there is movement forward already to buy into the idea behind those practices, and it has to be something that can be done, that can actually be done on the ground. There's all sorts of difficulties in that process, either with industry or NGOs pulling too hard in one direction or another, or different opinions. There's also important challenges around making sure that you've got sort of that, think global, act local. So you've got a global good practice, but it's also locally applicable. So often you'll have standards that have a global principles and criteria, but local indicators or local interpretation. And often that's also developed in a multi-stakeholder but more local way. So it is really about compromise. Now, that said, there are some areas where most standards will agree to reference an international agreement. So the ILO conventions is one example where there is actually global agreement on certain human, work-related, labor-related practices, there doesn't, and so those are referenced then. So rather than recreate the wheel on all of that, those ILO conventions are often referenced in the standards. But most of that doesn't exist for biodiversity. So how deep do you go? How far do you go? There's a lot of negotiation. There's very little in terms of sustainability that can actually just be hard quantified. And even then there might be the question of how much of the market do you want to be able to do this, and how do you drive change over time? So it is about the compromise as a way of building buy-in and uptake. So that's the first question. Certification versus a certificate. Generally, when we refer to certification, we're talking about the audit. So there is a certification audit, which is generally done by an entity called a certification body. They are an actual, ISO has codes around what is certification in a very formal sense. It's often used very informally, but in a formal sense, ISO has a code for the actual process of doing a certification audit, and what it means to be a certification body and how you recognize those bodies. So it's generally done through an audit process. Verification can sometimes be an audit as well. It's usually seen as being a lighter form of audit. So a certification audit results in a certificate. So it's more the action and the results, but a challenge there, and this just comes to sort of precision of language, I guess. A certificate could be anything, right? It could be, a certificate of good standing, or a certificate that you've done your self-assessment. I think there's a lot of loose language around the concept of a certificate, whereas ISO has quite stringent language on what is certification. And that's where I think things do get confusing. So I'm going to talk about the typology of standards, and I will be challenged by some of this. So most of our members, ISEAL members, not all, and we're seeing evolution here, but most of them are what we would call production standards. So they are single phase in the sense that it only applies really to the way something is, the way the forest is managed, the way the farm is managed, perhaps the way production happens in the factory. There is a little bit of overlap in some cases with management systems. So you do see an interesting overlap is in agriculture, you have group certification, where I mentioned Fairtrade. So you might have, you can't do a certification for every single small farmer in a country. So there's 500,000 or more small coffee farmers in Colombia. You can't go to 500,000 farms. That's crazy, and it's inefficient and expensive and unfair to them. So they often are in groups, and the group is certified through a management system. So it's actually a bit of a hybrid, because it's the production that's in the Fairtrade standard, but then also the group is being audited for its management system of the group, for how it manages that production. So perhaps we've been, it's a little not fully correct to say that they're all mutually exclusive. The process might be more about how the entire, well, in the case of organic, it goes all the way through the farming to how it's handled, to how it's separated, and so on. Let's see if I'm going to be able to. Life cycle. So most eco labels, what we think of as eco labels, take a life cycle approach, which would be much more about calculating footprint in various elements of the life cycle. Single attribute would be very much just this, it's lead free, or it's, I'm trying to think of another one that I can think of right now. GMO free would be a single attribute approach. And feel free, any of you in the chat box, to disagree with me, because I don't consider myself an expert on all of the different types of standards. So please feel free to share your expertise as well. Thanks. Thanks, Ira. Any more questions?
Well, if you're willing to field a couple more, even in with brief responses, I've got two more that I think are worthwhile for the audience to hear. One is you had 2-3 slides that linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And I guess another fact from the sustainability in higher education field is that folks are just beginning to learn about the SDGs and have not really grasped their potential significance. So the question is, does ISEAL feel that it's important to link its work and the work of its members to an understanding of the SDGs? That's one. Another question is, most of the folks on the line here are based in the US or North America. And a question that came up is, have you seen a distinct difference in the uptake or acceptance of sustainability standards internationally as opposed to the US market itself? And I'll turn it back to you, Karin.
Yeah, so to not take too long on those responses, yes, definitely we are seeing an importance to link to the SDGs, partly because we are seeing a very interesting trend globally of businesses being focused on their impact on the SDGs. So it is becoming a guiding framework for thinking about sustainability, and for businesses and governments to think about what are the different approaches they're going to take. You know, where do they have the ability to create impact, and what approaches are they going to take to create impact, and those impacts being framed by the SDGs. I have been surprised to see how much that seems to have driven thinking in the emerging economies, for example, on awareness around sustainability and the importance of sustainability. So not linked like, you know, straitjacket, but yes, I do think increasingly it will be a framework that people will talk about sustainability impacts within, and therefore important to have that link. And if any of you are interested in that, we did a report with World Wildlife Fund that's on that standardsimpacts.org website, or you could probably Google it, that is on the ability of sustainability standards to help businesses create impact in the SDGs. And it was a joint publication of ISEAL and World Wildlife Fund. And it's, I think, really interesting. So I encourage you to go have a look for that. In North America, you know, North America has been a little bit behind European companies in terms of uptake of sustainability. But one thing I was told by a corporate sustainability officer who works for a multinational company that's based in Europe but has extensive operations in the US, a retailer, and she had been posted in the Netherlands and then in the US for several years, and her comment was that in the US they might be slower to decide to move, but once the decision is made, they move faster, and quite a bit more convincingly, or that the company becomes more committed and more serious about the commitment. So there are quite a number of companies that are increasingly, in the US, that are increasingly deepening their commitment to sustainability and sustainable practices. Some questions about standards or international standards. I find it interesting that we see in a lot of the emerging economies more of an interest in locally, nationally developed standards. And by nationally, I don't mean necessarily the government, but created in their country. And that's a similar approach in the US. And I see that a bit as a not emerging economy, developed economy difference, but more of a large countries versus smaller countries. That in large economies, there is more of a desire to drive or to have that sense of it being driven locally. And so we do see a bit of that in the US, with more of a desire to take US-based approaches rather than sort of be part of the international approach. A little bit. I don't have a whole lot of details on different market uptake trends, but that's one difference that we're seeing.
Thank you, Karin. I guess in closing, and the question I would tee up for you is understanding that the faculty attendees on this call are responsible for training the next generation of sustainability leaders, and understanding that that next generation doesn't know much yet about sustainability standards, even if it is repetitive of some of your answers in the Q&A period. What do you think the most important item or items are that teaching faculty need to convey about the significance of sustainability standards, thus answering the question posed in the title of this webinar?
I guess one of the things I would leave with is that the challenges of sustainability are huge, and therefore scale is needed in transformation, and that the private sector is seen as a critical partner in driving that transformation, also recognizing the important and increasingly important role of governments, but that the private sector has an ability to move, and that you need approaches that are not always this little project and that little project, but that sustainability standards do offer an approach to taking a real global sector approach to sustainability and driving common understanding and uptake of practices then across the whole sector. And I would add to that, I think that we also recognize that standards and certification or verification alone aren't going to solve all the problems. And we are really increasingly pushing for collaboration, coordination, and bringing the various sector actors that are dealing with different approaches, so governments and standards and industry and NGOs together, to think about what are all of the solutions needed to create change, because there is no silver bullet. So we don't think standards are the only approach, but we think they're a really important element of transformation at scale.
I think that was a great closing message, Karin. Thanks again to you and your entire ISEAL team for sharing these insights with our community today. Again, much appreciated for this extraordinary presentation.
Thank you, Ira, and thanks to all of you on the webinar.
Thank you. Signing off now. Thanks for your participation.